The golden chandeliers of the rooftop bar glistened over a crowd dressed to impress. The hum of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, a testament to the carefree indulgence of New York's elite. At the center of it all sat Alexander Carter, heir to Carter Enterprises, his sharp navy suit tailored to perfection. With his piercing blue eyes and a smirk that screamed confidence, Alexander had the world at his feet, or so he thought. "I'm telling you," said Brian Langston, Alexander's oldest friend and an equally wealthy provocateur, "you're too predictable, Alex. The women you date, they're all the same. Models, actresses, the occasional influencer. You wouldn't know a real challenge if it slapped you in the face." Alexander leaned back, raising an eyebrow as he swirled the whiskey in his glass. "And what, pray tell, do you call a real challenge, Langston?" A chorus of laughter erupted from the group seated around the table, their smug grins revealing that they'd already concocted a plan. Caroline Royce, a designer known for her biting wit, leaned forward. "A real challenge, darling, would be someone entirely out of your league. Someone who doesn't fit into this perfect little bubble of yours." Alexander's smirk didn't waver. "Go on." Brian's grin widened as he placed his phone on the table. A photo pulled up on the screen. The image was of Sarah Roberts, an ex-literature teacher turned bookstore clerk. In her early 40s, Sarah was no longer the slender, vibrant woman she once was. Years of personal struggle had left their mark. Lines of worry etched her face, and her figure reflected a life where self-care had taken a back seat. "Her," Brian declared. Sarah Roberts, 42, divorced, lives in a little apartment on the West Side, works at the bookstore on 5th. She's been through the ringer. Let's see if the great Alexander Carter can charm her. Alexander frowned at the audacity. "And why exactly would I waste my time on this experiment?" Caroline's laughter was sharp. "Because you've got something to prove. We'll make it interesting, $1 million stake. If you can woo her, marry her, and keep up the charade for 6 months, the pot's yours. If not, well," she let the implication linger. The table erupted in cheers as the idea caught fire, but Alexander's gaze remained fixed on Sarah's photo. She was nothing like the women he was used to pursuing. And yet, beneath the quiet exhaustion in her eyes, there was something unspoken, a depth that intrigued him, though he wouldn't admit it aloud. "All right," he said, his voice calm but laced with arrogance. "You're on. I'll have her wrapped around my finger in no time." The group howled in approval, raising their glasses in a toast. But as Alexander left the bar that night, the weight of his decision began to settle on him. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but a sense that this game might prove more complex than he anticipated. The gentle hum of the coffee grinder filled the air as Sarah Roberts wiped the counter of the small, cozy bookstore cafe where she worked. Her hands, rough from years of labor and care, moved methodically, though her mind wandered. It was a quiet Thursday morning, and the shop, tucked between larger establishments on Fifth Avenue, was mostly empty. A middle-aged man in a tweed jacket perused the poetry section, but Sarah barely noticed. Her thoughts drifted back to a time when her life was filled with ambition and joy, a time when she stood confidently in front of a classroom, her voice breathing life into the works of Austen, Dickens, and Whitman. "Mrs. Roberts," a student once said, her hand timidly raised in the back of the room, "how do you make it all sound so alive?" Sarah had smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Because literature is alive, Sophia. Every word, every page, it all holds a heartbeat. You just have to listen." That version of Sarah seemed like a stranger now. After her mother's unexpected death 5 years ago, her world unraveled. Marion Roberts had been Sarah's anchor, a fiercely independent woman who raised Sarah on her own after her husband left when Sarah was 6. Losing her mother to a sudden illness left a void so vast that Sarah had struggled to breathe through the grief. The loss had been compounded by the failure of her marriage to Henry, a man whose promises of love and support faded as Sarah's grief grew. He'd left, citing her lack of vitality and his inability to endure her sadness. It was a bitter blow, but Sarah endured it in silence, the same way She had faced every challenge life threw at her. The emotional toll took its physical form. Her once vibrant energy waned, and she sought comfort in food and solitude. The pounds crept on, the mirror reflecting a person she no longer recognized. Eventually, she left her teaching position, a decision that haunted her even now. "Sarah, are you all right?" The voice startled her. It was Margaret, the cafe's elderly owner, peering at her from behind thick glasses. "Yes, I'm fine," Sarah said quickly, forcing a smile. She set down the rag and turned her attention to the counter display. Margaret tilted her head, unconvinced. "You know, dear, you've been a bit lost in thought lately. If you ever need someone to talk to," Sarah nodded politely, grateful for Margaret's kindness, but unwilling to burden her. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm just tired, that's all." The door jingled as someone entered, and Sarah instinctively glanced up. Her stomach sank when she saw Melissa Davenport stride in, the sound of her designer heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Melissa was everything Sarah wasn't: slim, stylish, and effortlessly confident. "Sarah," Melissa said with a saccharine smile, approaching the counter. "I couldn't believe it when I heard you were working here. It's such an unexpected career shift." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, but she kept her voice steady. "Hello, Melissa. Can I get you anything?" "Oh, just a latte. Skim milk. No sugar, of course," Melissa replied, leaning casually against the counter. She studied Sarah for a moment before adding, "You know, I always wondered why you gave up teaching. You were so passionate about it. What happened?" Sarah's grip tightened around the coffee cup she was preparing, but she refused to take the bait. "Life happened," she said simply, sliding the latte across the counter. Melissa smirked. "Well, I suppose we all make sacrifices. Though, if I'm honest, I can't imagine giving up something I loved so much." She tapped her manicured nails on the counter. "Of course, I was lucky to marry Victor. I don't have to worry about, well, this." She gestured vaguely at the cafe. "Good for you, Melissa," Sarah said, her voice clipped. "Enjoy your latte." Melissa chuckled, her laughter light but laced with condescension. "Oh, I always do. Take care, Sarah." As the door jingled again and Melissa walked out, Sarah released a slow, measured breath. Her composure cracked for a moment, and her shoulders sagged under the weight of her emotions. Melissa's words, though thinly veiled in civility, were sharp daggers aimed at Sarah's insecurities. But as she looked out the window, the city bustling beyond the glass, a flicker of resolve stirred in her chest. Sarah Roberts had faced worse than Melissa Davenport's petty cruelty. She had weathered storms that most people couldn't imagine. And though she didn't know it yet, her life was about to change in ways she never anticipated. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the bustling streets of Manhattan. Sarah Roberts sat at a corner table in Mulberry Cafe, an unassuming little spot that served as her favorite refuge. She took a sip of chamomile tea, its warmth soothing her nerves after a long day. The cafe, with its faded wallpaper and mismatched chairs, had become a place where she could fade into the background, observing life rather than being part of it. She was jotting down notes in her journal, a habit she'd picked up to organize her thoughts and stave off the loneliness that often crept in uninvited. Her pen scratched across the page, a comforting rhythm, until the sudden shadow of a figure loomed over her. "Excuse me," a voice said, smooth and deep. Startled, Sarah looked up, and her breath caught for a moment. Standing before her was a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity she wasn't prepared for. His presence was magnetic, but something about the easy confidence in his posture made her immediately wary. "Do you mind if I sit here?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Sarah blinked, her thoughts scrambling. The cafe wasn't crowded. There were plenty of open tables. She hesitated, her instincts urging her to decline, but his polite demeanor disarmed her. Sure," she said finally, gesturing to the chair. "Thank you." The man smiled, setting down a small black coffee before taking the seat. Sarah watched him carefully, unsure of his intentions. Strangers didn't often approach her, and certainly not ones who looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine. She closed her journal, clutching it protectively. "Do I know you?" she asked cautiously. The man leaned back, his smile widening slightly. "Not yet. I'm Alexander Carter." He extended a hand across the table, her brow furrowed as she hesitated before shaking his hand briefly. His name didn't ring any bells, but something about him felt out of place, like a piece of a puzzle dropped into the wrong box. "Sarah," she said simply, pulling her hand back. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah." His tone was warm, almost too warm. "I hope I'm not intruding. Well, I saw you sitting here and thought I'd say hello. You seem interesting." Sarah's defenses shot up at that. Interesting? Was this some kind of joke? She glanced down at herself, an oversized cardigan, comfortable jeans, and the kind of practical shoes that prioritized function over style. Interesting wasn't a word people usually associated with her. "Why would you think that?" she asked, her tone guarded. Alexander chuckled, as though her skepticism amused him. "Call it a hunch. I have an eye for people, and you seem like someone who has stories worth hearing." Sarah frowned, unsure whether to feel flattered or annoyed. "Well, I hate to disappoint you, Mr. Carter, but I'm not very good at small talk." "Perfect," Alexander said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm terrible at it too." Despite herself, Sarah felt a flicker of amusement at his quick response. Still, she wasn't about to let her guard down. "So, what brings you here? You don't exactly look like the kind of person who frequents places like this." He smirked, acknowledging the subtle jab. "You caught me. I'm more of a black tie gala kind of guy, but I've been trying to branch out, explore different parts of the city. This cafe came highly recommended." "By who?" "Let's call it a lucky accident," he said with a shrug, his charm effortless. Sarah didn't buy it for a second. People like him didn't stumble into places like Mulberry Cafe by chance. And yet, there he was, sipping his coffee as though they were old friends. She decided to test his intentions. "Well, Mr. Carter, I'm sure a man like you has plenty of stories to share. What do you do for a living?" "I run a company," he said vaguely, as though the details didn't matter. "But that's boring. What about you?" "I work at a bookstore," Sarah replied, deliberately leaving out the cafe part. "Ah, so you're a lover of books. That explains the notebook." He gestured to her journal. "Do you write?" "A little," she admitted reluctantly. "Mostly just thoughts. Nothing worth publishing. Don't sell yourself short," he said with a smile. "Some of the best stories start that way." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the cafe opened, and in walked Melissa Davenport, her presence as unwelcome as a cold wind. Sarah stiffened as Melissa's eyes immediately landed on her table. The look of surprise on Melissa's face quickly morphed into one of disdainful curiosity as she approached. Well, Sarah," Melissa said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Was surprised to see you here, and with company, no less." Sarah clenched her jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. Alexander, however, turned to Melissa with a polite smile. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. Melissa Davenport," she said, her tone shifting to one of forced charm as she extended her hand. "And you are?" "Alexander Carter," he replied smoothly, shaking her hand briefly before returning his attention to Sarah. "Sarah and I were just getting to know each other." Melissa's eyebrows shot up, and her gaze flicked between them, her curiosity turning to something more calculating. "How interesting," she said, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Well, I won't keep you. Enjoy your chat." With that, Melissa turned on her heel and left the cafe, though not without casting one last pointed look over her shoulder. Sarah exhaled slowly, her tension palpable. "I'm sorry about that," she muttered. "No need to apologize," Alexander said, his tone light. "Friend of yours?" "Not exactly." Sarah's voice was bitter. Alexander studied her for a moment, as though trying to piece together a puzzle. "Well," he said finally, standing and placing a business card on the table, "this has been a pleasure. I hope we can do it again sometime." Before she could protest, he was gone, leaving Sarah staring after him, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and unease. Weeks passed, and Alexander Carter became an increasingly frequent presence in Sarah's life. It started with his seemingly coincidental appearances, bumping into her at the bookstore, stopping by the cafe for his usual black coffee, and striking up conversations with a practiced ease that kept her guard up. At first, Sarah remained skeptical. Men like Alexander didn't chase after women like her, and his persistent interest felt suspicious. Yet, against her better judgment, she found herself softening. His charm, coupled with a surprising attentiveness, disarmed her bit by bit. He listened when she spoke, asked about her favorite books, and even remembered small details, like how she preferred her tea or the way her eyes lit up when discussing poetry. One chilly evening, as the autumn leaves danced in the wind, Alexander invited Sarah to dinner. She hesitated, but eventually agreed, reasoning that it was just a meal. He took her to a cozy French bistro tucked away from the bustling main streets. It wasn't the grand, ostentatious venue she'd imagined he would choose, and that alone made her wonder if she'd misjudged him. As they sat across from each other, sipping wine and sharing stories, Sarah felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. Alexander was surprisingly attentive, steering the conversation toward her life, her passions, and her dreams. "You must have loved teaching," he said, his voice genuinely curious. "I did," Sarah admitted, a wistful smile crossing her lips. There's nothing quite like seeing a student's face light up when they finally understand something. But life has a way of changing plans. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you ever think about going back?" "Sometimes," she said, her tone tinged with regret. "But that part of my life feels so far away now. I'm not sure I'd know how to start again." Alexander nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Sarah." His words caught her off guard, and she looked down, her cheeks warming. She was about to respond when the waiter arrived with dessert, cutting the moment short. The evening ended with Alexander walking her home, his easy confidence balancing out her lingering awkwardness. As they reached her apartment building, he hesitated before speaking. "Sarah," he said, his tone suddenly serious, "can I see you again? I've enjoyed getting to know you, and I'd like us to spend more time together." Her heart raced, and she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know, Alexander. This feels unexpected. Sometimes the best things in life are," he said with a soft smile. "No pressure. Just think about it." He left her standing at her door, her thoughts spinning. Weeks later, their meetings became regular. Dinners, walks through the park, even late-night conversations about philosophy and art. Sarah found herself letting down her guard, though a small voice in the back of her mind warned her not to get too comfortable. Then came the day that shook her world. It was a brisk Saturday afternoon. Alexander had insisted on taking her to a small art gallery he frequented. As they strolled through the halls, admiring the paintings, Sarah couldn't help but feel a growing unease. Alexander seemed distracted, his usual lighthearted demeanor replaced by something more serious. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they stopped in front of a serene landscape painting. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Actually, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her stomach dropped. "Okay." Taking her hand, he led her to a quiet corner of the gallery. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but low, "I've been thinking a lot about us. About you." Her heart pounded as she searched his face for clues. "Alexander, who are you?" "Marry me," he said, his words cutting through her sentence like a knife. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. "What?" "I'm serious," he said, holding her gaze. "I want to marry you, Sarah." Her laughter came unbidden, a nervous, disbelieving sound. "Alexander, we've known each other for what? A few months. This is ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous to me," he said firmly. "You're everything I didn't know I needed. You're kind, brilliant, and completely unlike anyone I've ever met. I know this is sudden, but I've never been more sure of anything." She pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense." We're so different. Our lives, your world. It's not my world, Alexander. Then let me make it your world, he said, his voice softening. I know I'm asking for a lot, but I don't want to lose you, Sarah. Her defenses flared. This is too fast. I've been alone for so long, and you can't just walk into my life and expect me to. I'm not expecting anything, he interrupted. I just want to try, to take a chance on something real. Tears welled in her eyes as she wrestled with her emotions. Part of her longed for the companionship he offered, the possibility of a new chapter. But another part of her screamed that it was too good to be true. I need time, she whispered. Alexander nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm not going anywhere. As she left the gallery, her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Alexander's proposal lingered in her mind, both a beacon of hope and a source of fear. She didn't know what her answer would be yet, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same. The news of Sarah Roberts' engagement to Alexander Carter spread faster than wildfire through Manhattan circles, though not entirely by their design. Words slipped through the cracks, likely by someone who spotted them together at the gallery. And soon it became the subject of whispers in both her quiet bookstore world and Alexander's glamorous elite sphere. For Sarah, the attention was suffocating. She had reluctantly agreed to Alexander's proposal weeks after their conversation in the gallery, setting careful conditions to protect her independence and ensure she wasn't swept away by the overwhelming current of his life. Yet, even her cautious acceptance hadn't prepared her for the judgment that followed. Are you sure about this, Sarah? Margaret asked one evening as they closed up the cafe. She folded her arms, her brow furrowed with concern. I mean, Alexander seems nice, but a millionaire? Isn't that a bit sudden? I know it sounds absurd, Sarah admitted, her voice weary. Trust me, I've gone over every reason why this shouldn't work. But he's been persistent, and I can't deny that he's made me feel. She paused, searching for the right words. Special, Margaret offered gently. Sarah nodded. For the first time in years, Margaret sighed, resting a hand on Sarah's shoulder. If anyone deserves happiness, it's you. Just keep your eyes open, all right? The wedding itself was modest by choice. Sarah had insisted on a small ceremony held in the garden of a quaint inn just outside the city. Alexander, to her surprise, agreed without hesitation, brushing off the protests of his social circle, who had expected nothing less than a grand spectacle. Are you sure you don't want something more extravagant? He had asked her one evening as they sat in her living room, surrounded by invitations and floral samples. This is already extravagant for me, Sarah replied, smiling wryly. I don't want a circus, Alexander. Just something simple, with people who actually care about us. He leaned back, studying her. All right, whatever makes you happy. On the morning of the wedding, the garden buzzed with quiet anticipation. Strings of fairy lights wove through the trees, casting a soft glow over the crisp white chairs and modest floral arrangements. A small group of guests gathered, friends from Sarah's bookstore and cafe, a few of Alexander's closest associates, and his parents, who had flown in from Europe for the occasion. As Sarah prepared in the inn's small bridal suite, her reflection in the mirror felt almost foreign. Her dress, an elegant A-line gown in ivory, hugged her frame in a way that felt both flattering and unfamiliar. Margaret, who had offered to be her attendant for the day, stood behind her, adjusting the delicate lace veil. You look beautiful, Sarah, Margaret said softly. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. I just hope I can get through this without tripping over my own feet. They both laughed, though Sarah's nerves were evident. When the ceremony began, and Sarah walked down the aisle to the soft strains of a string quartet, her eyes locked on Alexander. He stood at the altar, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a rare vulnerability. For a moment, the world seemed to blur around them, the whispers of doubt and judgment fading into the background. The officiant's words were brief but heartfelt, and when Alexander took Sarah's hands in his voice trembled slightly as he spoke his vows. I know this isn't what you expected, he said, his eyes searching hers. but I promise to spend every day proving that this, us, is real. Sarah's own vows were quieter, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. I never thought I'd find myself here again, but you've given me something I didn't think I deserved, a second chance. I'll try my best to honor that. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause was polite but subdued. Sarah noticed the sideways glances, the skeptical murmurs from Alexander's guests, and even a few judgmental stares from her own acquaintances. One voice, however, rose above the rest. "Well, isn't this something?" Melissa Davenport drawled as she sauntered over to Sarah during the small reception. She held a champagne flute in one hand, her eyes glinting with malice. "I never thought I'd see the day. Sarah Roberts, married to a millionaire. You must be thrilled." Sarah clenched her jaw, refusing to take the bait. "Melissa, I didn't realize you were on the guest list." "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Melissa said with a thin smile. "After all, it's not every day someone like you lands someone like him. It's almost inspiring." Alexander appeared at Sarah's side, his presence immediately silencing Melissa's barbs. "Is there something you need, Ms. Davenport?" he asked coolly, his tone polite but firm. Melissa's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Not all, Mr. Carter. Just offering my congratulations." As Melissa slinked away, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Alexander turned to her, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was tight. "It's just people like her. They can't stand seeing me happy." Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Let them talk. None of it matters. This is our day." "Sarah," his words were comforting, but as the evening wore on, doubt began to creep in. The whispers and stares weren't just figments of her imagination. They were real, and they cut deeper than she cared to admit. That night, as they returned to their suite, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the room's ornate mirror. Alexander approached, sitting beside her. "You're thinking too much," he said softly. She glanced at him, her eyes troubled. "Am I? Or are they right? Maybe this was a mistake, Alexander. I'm not sure I belong in your world. You belong wherever you choose to belong," he said firmly. "And I want you in mine." Though his words brought her some comfort, the doubts didn't vanish entirely. The road ahead felt uncertain, and as Sarah drifted to sleep that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their challenges. The first few weeks of marriage should have been blissful, but for Sarah Roberts and Alexander Carter, the reality of their differences quickly began to show. Their lives, so far removed from one another, clashed in subtle but growing ways. It started with small gestures that, while well-intentioned, made Sarah feel as though she were losing herself. One morning, she awoke to find a beautifully wrapped box sitting on the breakfast table of their sleek penthouse apartment. The apartment itself was an adjustment, modern, vast, and intimidating compared to the small but cozy spaces Sarah was used to. Alexander stood by the counter, casually sipping his espresso as he gestured to the gift. "Open it," he said with a smile. Sarah hesitated, her fingers fumbling with the ribbon. Inside, she found an elegant designer dress, its fabric shimmering under the morning light. It was stunning, undeniably expensive, and entirely impractical for her life. "Alexander," she said carefully, running her fingers over the fabric, "this is beautiful, but I don't have anywhere to wear something like this." "You'll find a place," he replied easily. "I thought it would look perfect on you. I saw it and couldn't resist." His words were kind, but Sarah felt a pang of unease. She set the box aside. "Thank you, but I don't need things like this. Really, I'd prefer if you didn't spend so much money on me." Alexander's brow furrowed slightly. "It's not about the money, Sarah. I just wanted to do something nice for you." "I know," she said softly, "and I appreciate it. But this, it's not me." The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered. The pattern continued. Alexander, accustomed to using his wealth as a means of expression, showered Sarah with gifts: a gold bracelet, a pair of designer shoes, a catered dinner from a Michelin-starred chef. Each time, Sarah accepted with polite gratitude, but gently reminded him that she didn't need extravagance to feel valued. "Why won't you let me take care of you?" Alexander finally asked one evening, exasperation slipping into his tone as they sat in the living room. Sarah sighed, setting down the book she'd been reading. "Because I don't want to be someone who depends on luxury to feel cared for." "That's not who I am, Alexander." "It's not about dependence," he countered. "It's about giving you the life you deserve." She looked at him, her voice calm but firm. "What I deserve is to be seen for who I am, not for what you think I should be." His shoulders stiffened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a crack in his usually confident exterior. He didn't respond, and she let the conversation drop, though the silence between them felt heavy. Outside forces didn't help matters. Melissa Davenport, undeterred by her earlier rebuff at the wedding, had taken it upon herself to become a fixture in their social circles. At every gala, every dinner party, she lingered on the fringes, her sharp tongue finding ways to needle Sarah. "You must be so overwhelmed," Melissa said during one such event, her voice dripping with false concern. "I mean, going from, well, where you were to all of this." She gestured grandly to the lavish ballroom, its crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across the marble floor. Sarah forced a smile, though her patience was wearing thin. "It's been an adjustment, but I'm managing." "Of course you are," Melissa said with a tight smile. "Alexander is such a generous man, isn't he? I imagine it makes things much easier." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander, who had overheard, stepped in. "Melissa," he said coolly, his arms sliding protectively around Sarah's waist, "if you'll excuse us, I believe it's time for a dance." As he led Sarah onto the dance floor, she whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "Trust me," he replied, his jaw tight. "It was for the best." Despite Alexander's efforts to shield Sarah from the worst of the scrutiny, the whispers persisted. His social circle, though outwardly polite, was rife with judgment. Sarah heard it in the not-so-subtle comments about her appearance, her age, her background. It chipped away at her confidence, though she tried her best to hide it. One night, after a particularly grueling dinner party, she finally broke. "Do you even hear what they say about me?" she asked Alexander as they returned home, her voice trembling with emotion. "What does it matter what they say?" he replied, his tone defensive. "You know it's not true. It matters because I'm the one who has to endure it," she shot back. "I didn't ask for this life, Alexander. I didn't ask to be paraded around like some project you're working on." His expression darkened, and he ran a hand through his hair. "You're not a project, Sarah. Why do you keep thinking that?" "Because that's how it feels," she said, her voice rising. "You don't even realize how out of place I feel in your world. Every day, it's a reminder that I'm not good enough for these people. And the worst part, I'm starting to believe them." Alexander froze, her words hitting him harder than he expected. He reached for her, but she stepped back. "I need some air," she muttered, grabbing her coat and leaving before he could stop her. Sarah walked the city streets for hours, the cold air biting at her skin. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how easily the opinions of others had gotten under her skin. But more than that, she hated the growing distance between her and Alexander. When she finally returned home, the apartment was dark, except for a single lamp in the living room. Alexander was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes filled with remorse. "Sarah," he began, his voice quiet, "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Please, tell me what I can do." She hesitated, her exhaustion weighing heavily on her. "I don't need you to fix anything, Alexander. I just need you to see me, the real me, not the version you think I should be." He nodded slowly, his expression earnest. "I see you, Sarah. I always have. I don't want to lose you." Her anger softened, though the ache in her chest remained. "We're going to lose each other if we keep trying to force this. We need to figure out how to meet in the middle, or it's not going to work." Alexander reached for her hand, and this time, she let him take it. "We will," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes. For now, it was enough." But deep down, Sarah knew the road ahead would only get harder. The soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of conversations filled the grand dining hall of the Ellsworth Hotel. It was the kind of soiree Alexander Carter frequented, where Manhattan's elite mingled over rare wines and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Sarah stood at Alexander's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they navigated the room. Though she'd grown slightly more accustomed to these events, they still left her feeling like an outsider. The polished, perfumed crowd buzzed around her, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos a stark contrast to her understated elegance. Alexander had assured her that she looked beautiful, but her insecurities lingered, especially under the scrutiny of his acquaintances. And then there was Melissa Davenport. Melissa's arrival was as theatrical as always, her crimson dress hugging her figure perfectly as she made her way into the room, her head held high. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Alexander and Sarah, and a slow smile spread across her lips. "Sarah, darling," Melissa called out as she approached, her voice loud enough to turn a few heads. And Alexander, of course. What a lovely surprise. Sarah braced herself as Melissa leaned in to offer the barest suggestion of an air kiss. The gesture, though seemingly cordial, was laced with condescension. "Melissa," Alexander said curtly, his tone giving little room for pleasantries. Melissa's eyes flicked to him, her smile sharpening. "You're as charming as ever, Alexander. And Sarah," she added, her gaze settling on her with calculated sweetness, "you're looking comfortable tonight." Sarah stiffened, her cheeks burning. "Thank you," she said simply, refusing to take the bait. Melissa tilted her head, clearly disappointed by the lack of reaction. "I've been meaning to catch up with you, Sarah. How's married life treating you? Adjusting well to all this?" She gestured around the room, her tone feigning genuine curiosity. "It's been fine," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. "A bit overwhelming at times, but I'm getting used to it." "Well, I'm sure Alexander is doing everything he can to make you feel at home," Melissa said, her words dripping with implication. "He's always been so generous." "Enough, Melissa," Alexander interjected, his voice low but firm. "If you'll excuse us, Sarah and I have other people to speak with." He began to lead Sarah away, but Melissa wasn't finished. "Oh, Alexander," she said, her voice loud enough to stop them. "One more thing. Victor and I are hosting a dinner party next weekend. You should both come. It'll be delightful." Alexander hesitated, his jaw tightening. He rarely accepted invitations from Melissa, knowing her penchant for stirring trouble. But before he could respond, Sarah surprised him. "We'll think about it," she said evenly, meeting Melissa's gaze. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile never faltered. "Wonderful. I'll look forward to it." As they left the party that night, the tension between Sarah and Alexander was palpable. "Why did you agree to her dinner?" Alexander asked as their car wove through the city streets. "I didn't agree. I said we'd think about it," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. "Sarah, Melissa doesn't invite people to socialize. She invites them to humiliate them. She's made it clear she doesn't respect you, and I don't want you to be subjected to her games." "I appreciate that, Alexander, but I can handle Melissa," Sarah said, turning to look at him. "Avoiding her isn't going to make her stop. If anything, it'll make me look weak, and I'm tired of being treated like I don't belong." Alexander studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You're stronger than she'll ever be, you know that?" Sarah smiled faintly, though the knot in her stomach remained. The following weekend, the dinner party arrived. Melissa's home, a sprawling brownstone in the Upper East Side, was as meticulously designed as she was. The rooms gleamed with understated luxury, every detail curated to perfection. Sarah entered on Alexander's arm, her head held high despite the whispers she could feel trailing behind them. Melissa greeted them with exaggerated warmth, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed malice. "Sarah, you look radiant," Melissa said, eyeing her up and down. "That dress suits you perfectly. Alexander must have excellent taste." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her tone measured. "It's something I picked out myself. The night unfolded as Sarah expected, with Melissa orchestrating conversations to highlight Sarah's differences from the group. Subtle comments about her background, her age, and her appearance were woven into the dialogue like barbs hidden in silk. "Sarah," Melissa said at one point, her tone falsely innocent, "how did you and Alexander meet?" "It must have been serendipitous." Sarah took a sip of her wine, refusing to be rattled. "It was," she said with a calm smile. "Sometimes the best things in life happen unexpectedly." Melissa's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Well, aren't you lucky?" Later in the evening, as the guests mingled over dessert, Melissa cornered Alexander near the bar. She placed a hand lightly on his arm, leaning in closer than necessary. "Alexander," she purred, "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to settle down so quickly. And with someone like Sarah." He stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "What exactly are you trying to say, Melissa?" "Oh, nothing at all," she said, her smile sly. "It's just that she's so different from the women you've been with. I suppose that's the appeal, isn't it? A change of pace. Something refreshing." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Melissa, if you're looking for a reaction, you won't get one. Sarah is my wife, and I won't tolerate anyone disrespecting her." Melissa's smile faltered again, her eyes flashing with irritation. "I didn't mean to offend," she said smoothly. "I'm just looking out for you. You deserve the best, Alexander." "And I have the best," he said sharply, turning to walk away. As the evening wound down and Alexander and Sarah prepared to leave, Melissa's words lingered in the air, a reminder that her presence in their lives was far from over. It was a quiet evening in the Carter penthouse. The city lights outside glimmered like scattered diamonds, but inside, a heavy silence lingered between Sarah and Alexander. The dinner party at Melissa's had left an indelible mark on both of them. Though Alexander had brushed off Melissa's taunts, the incident had unsettled him. For Sarah, the evening had stirred memories she preferred to keep buried. Alexander, sensing her unease, had spent the past week trying to reconnect to make her feel comfortable. But despite his efforts, Sarah remained distant, her smiles forced and her answers clipped. That night, while Alexander worked in his study, Sarah found herself aimlessly wandering through the apartment. Her thoughts swirled, a storm of emotions she couldn't quite name. She ended up in a library, a grand room filled with shelves of books, their leather-bound spines gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier. She pulled a book at random, flipping through the pages without really reading. It was an anthology of poetry, and one of the lines caught her eye. "The past is never dead. It's not even past." A sharp pang of emotion gripped her chest. She snapped the book shut, her hands trembling. She wanted to leave the room, to escape the weight of those words, but just as she turned, Alexander appeared in the doorway. "I was wondering where you wandered off to," he said, his voice gentle. "I just needed some air," Sarah replied, setting the book back on the shelf. Alexander stepped closer, his expression softening as he noticed the tension in her posture. "Sarah," he began carefully, "is everything all right? You've been distant." "I'm fine," she said quickly, but her voice wavered. "You're not," he said, his tone firmer but still kind. "I can see it. Something's bothering you and I want to help, but I can't if you won't let me in." She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of a shelf. "It's nothing you can fix, Alexander." "Maybe not," he said, stepping closer, "but I want to understand. Please." Sarah looked at him, his sincerity piercing through the wall she'd tried to build. With a sigh, she sat on the leather sofa in the corner of the room, gesturing for him to join her. "It's not easy to talk about," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take your time," Alexander said, sitting beside her. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Then, slowly, Sarah began to speak. "I was 24 when my mother got sick," she said, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "She was the strongest person I knew. Sharp, independent, always pushing me to be better. She raised me on her own after my father left. For as long as I can remember, it was just the two of us against the world." Alexander listened intently, his face softening as she continued. She started having migraines, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. We thought it was stress. She worked so hard to support us. But then the doctors found it, a tumor. By the time they caught it, it was already too late. Alexander reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers trembling in his. She was gone within 6 months, Sarah said, a tear slipping down her cheek. Just like that, my whole world fell apart. I stopped caring about everything, my job, my friends, myself. I gained weight. I lost my spark. People called it grief, but it felt more like being hollow, like I wasn't a person anymore. Just this empty shell. She paused, swallowing hard. My husband at the time, Henry, he tried to be supportive at first, but he wasn't patient. He didn't understand why I couldn't just move on. One day, he came home and told me he couldn't do it anymore. He left, and I didn't even have the energy to fight him on it. Alexander's grip on her hand tightened, his expression darkening at the thought of someone abandoning her in such a vulnerable state. I left teaching shortly after that, Sarah continued. I couldn't face a classroom full of bright, eager faces when I felt like a failure. I took a job at the bookstore because it was quiet, and I didn't have to talk to anyone if I didn't want to. Her voice cracked, and she looked away. I thought that was going to be my life. Quiet, lonely, and small. Then you came along, and suddenly everything's loud and bright and overwhelming. Alexander reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. I didn't know, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you went through all of that. You couldn't have known, she said, managing a weak smile. It's not something I talk about. I've spent years trying to put behind me, but it's still with you, he said, his gaze searching hers. And I want to help you carry it, if you'll let me. Sarah's heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe him, to let herself lean on him without fear. But the vulnerability was terrifying. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered. You're not, Alexander said firmly. You've never been a burden, Sarah. You're the strongest person I know, even if you don't see it. His words broke through her defenses, and she leaned into him, tears spilling freely now. Alexander held her close, his arms a protective cocoon around her. In that moment, something shifted between them. For the first time, Sarah felt truly seen, not as a project or prize, but as a person with all her scars and imperfections. And Alexander, holding her tightly, began to realize just how deeply he cared for her, far beyond the superficial game he'd once played. The atmosphere at the Davenport estate was electric, the lavish halls filled with the city's elite, their laughter and chatter mingling with the soft notes of a grand piano. Melissa stood near the center of the room, her practiced smile masking the growing irritation beneath. She swirled the champagne in her glass as she watched Sarah and Alexander arrive together, their presence drawing attention as usual. Melissa's sharp gaze swept over Sarah, taking in her understated black dress and minimal jewelry. While others may have found Sarah's simplicity elegant, Melissa saw it as yet another reminder of how poorly Sarah fit into this world. Enjoying the view, Melissa, came a sly voice from her left. Melissa turned to see Victoria Graham, a socialite with a penchant for stirring the pot. Not particularly, Melissa replied, her tone clipped. Victoria followed her gaze, smirking. Still can't believe Alexander chose her, huh? Must sting, considering how hard you tried to reel him in yourself. Melissa's jaw tightened, but she forced a laugh. Oh, please. Alexander's choices are his own, though I can't help but wonder how long this little fairy tale will last. Victoria raised an eyebrow, planning to make it shorter. Melissa didn't answer directly, but her smile was all the confirmation Victoria needed. Later that evening, Melissa found herself lingering near Alexander as he stepped away from Sarah to grab drinks at the bar. She seized the opportunity, slipping beside him with practiced ease. Alexander, she purred, her voice low and conspiratorial. You've been a hard man to pin down lately. I've been busy, Alexander said curtly, not sparing her a glance as he signaled to the bartender. I can see that, Melissa said, her tone light, but her words pointed. How is married life treating you? Must be quite the adjustment considering everything. Alexander turned to her then, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. It's treating me just fine. Thank you. Melissa's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I wasn't sure how much Sarah knew about your history. His brows furrowed slightly. What are you talking about? Oh, nothing, she said airily, her fingers tracing the stem of her glass. It's just that marriage is built on less than honest foundations can be so fragile. Secrets have a way of coming out eventually, don't they? Before Alexander could respond, Sarah appeared beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Everything all right? She asked, her eyes flicking between the two of them. Perfect, Melissa said, her smile razor sharp. Just catching up with Alexander. You're such a lucky woman, Sarah. He's quite the catch. Thank you, Sarah said coolly, meeting Melissa's gaze with quiet defiance. Melissa's smile didn't waver, but there was an unmistakable glint of malice in her eyes as she walked away. Melissa didn't waste time. She had heard whispers of the truth, fragments of conversations, and careless remarks from Alexander's more indiscreet friends. The bet, the game, the humiliation Sarah had unknowingly been drawn into. That night, she began piecing the story together, pulling every string she could to confirm her suspicions. By the time she had the full picture, her plan was already forming. A week later, Melissa hosted another event, a charity gala that practically demanded attendance from everyone in Alexander's circle. It was an opulent affair, with glittering chandeliers, endless champagne, and a stage for speeches and auctions. Sarah, who had reluctantly agreed to accompany Alexander, felt the familiar weight of unease as they entered the ballroom. Though she'd grown more accustomed to these events, Melissa's presence always left her on edge. As the evening progressed, Melissa worked the room with calculated precision, her honeyed words spreading like a slow poison. It's such a shame, she murmured to Victoria, ensuring she was overheard by a small cluster of guests. Sarah seems like such a sweet woman. If only she knew what someone asked, intrigued. Melissa's smile was coy, her voice dropping to a whisper. Oh, I shouldn't say. It's not my place. The bait was irresistible, and soon the whispers were everywhere. By the time the speeches began, the room was buzzing with speculation. It was during the auction portion of the evening that Melissa made her move. Standing on stage, her smile radiant, she addressed the crowd. Before we continue, she said, her voice commanding attention, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of the incredible couples here tonight. Love, after all, is what brings us together. Her eyes swept the room before landing on Sarah and Alexander. Take Alexander and Sarah Carter, for instance, she continued, her tone sickly sweet. Their story is truly inspiring. Who would have thought that a simple bet could lead to such enduring loves? The room fell silent, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat as every eye in the room turned toward her. What is she talking about? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Alexander's face was pale, his jaw clenched. Sarah, let's go, he said, standing abruptly and taking her hand. But Sarah pulled away, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. No, she said, her voice louder now. What is she talking about, Alexander? Melissa stepped down from the stage, her expression one of feigned concern. Oh dear, she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone could hear. I didn't mean to cause a scene. I just assumed Sarah knew about the little wager Alexander made with his friends. You know, the one where he bet he could. She trailed off, her gaze flicking towards Sarah with mock pity. Well, I'm sure he can explain it better than I can. The room was a storm of whispers now, the weight of the revelation pressing down on Sarah like a physical blow. She turned to Alexander, her eyes brimming with tears. Tell me she's lying, she pleaded. Alexander's silence was damning. He reached for her, his voice urgent. Sarah, please let me explain. No, she said, stepping back. Her voice shook, but it was resolute. "Don't. Not here." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the ballroom, her vision blurred by tears. Melissa watched her go, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. But as she turned back to the room, she caught the sharp glare Alexander directed her way. For the first time, her smile faltered. "You've gone too far, Melissa," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "Have I?" she replied, though her tone lacked its usual confidence. "I just thought she deserved the truth." Alexander didn't respond. He pushed past her, ignoring the murmurs and stares as he followed Sarah out into the cold night. The cold night air hit Alexander like a slap as he exited the grand ballroom, the buzz of stunned whispers still ringing in his ears. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows on the cobblestone path, and he spotted Sarah a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her figure was rigid, her posture screaming heartbreak and betrayal. "Sarah," he called, his voice urgent as he approached. She turned to face him, and the anguish in her eyes nearly stopped him in his tracks. Tears streaked her cheeks, but it was the mix of betrayal and disbelief in her expression that pierced his chest. "Don't," she said sharply, holding up a hand as he reached for her. "Don't you dare come any closer." "Sarah, please," he said, his voice cracking. "I can explain." "Explain?" she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "Explain what, Alexander? That I'm some kind of joke? That this, us, was all some sick game to use?" "It wasn't a game," he insisted, stepping closer despite her protest. "Not anymore. It started out—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "Don't try to soften it. It started as a game, a bet, something to amuse your friends." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration with himself evident. "I was an idiot, Sarah. I wasn't thinking. But everything changed once I got to know you." Her laughter was bitter, cutting through the cold air like a knife. "Do you even hear yourself? You expect me to believe that this, what, magically turned into love?" "Yes," he said desperately, "because it did. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I swear to you, Sarah, I love you." She shook her head, tears spilling anew. "How can you love someone you didn't even respect enough to approach honestly? You took my life, my trust, and turned it into a spectacle for your amusement." "That's not true," Alexander pleaded. "It wasn't about amusement. At first, I was proving something stupid to myself and to my friends. But then I saw you, the real you, and I realized how wrong I'd been. Sarah, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." She turned away, her hands gripping her arms as if to hold herself together. For a long moment, she said nothing, and the silence was deafening. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she said finally, her voice quieter but no less sharp. "I let myself believe in you. I let myself believe that someone like you could actually see someone like me, that you could love me for who I am, flaws and all. And the whole time, it was just a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Alexander said firmly, stepping closer again. "Maybe it started that way, but it's not anymore. I love you, Sarah. Not because of some bet, not because of some stupid dare. Because of who you are. You're strong, brilliant, and kind. You've changed me in ways I didn't even know I needed." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his desperately, as though trying to find a shred of sincerity in his words. "Do you even understand what you've done?" she asked. "You didn't just hurt me, Alexander. You humiliated me, in front of everyone. Melissa didn't expose me tonight. You did, the moment you started this." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of her accusation. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hurt you in a way I can never take back, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. But please, Sarah, don't walk away from us. Don't let what I did in the past ruin what we've built now." She shook her head, stepping back as he tried to close the distance between them. "You don't get to decide that," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't get to ruin me and then tell me how to feel about it." "Sarah," he said again, his voice breaking, but she turned away, her resolve firm. "Don't follow me, Alexander," she said, her back to him as she walked away. "I need time, and I need to be alone." Alexander stood frozen, watching her disappear into the night. The emptiness she left behind was overwhelming, a hollow ache that clawed at his chest. When he finally returned to the penthouse, it felt cold and sterile, its vastness suffocating without her presence. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the burn offered no comfort. The silence was unbearable, filled with the echo of her words. "You don't get to ruin me, and then tell me how to feel about it." For the first time in years, Alexander Carter felt truly lost. He spent the night pacing the apartment, replaying every moment of their relationship in his mind. He thought of the way her eyes lit up when she talked about literature, the quiet strength in her voice when she spoke of her past, the softness in her touch when she thought he wasn't paying attention. How had he let this happen? How had he taken something so pure, so real, and twisted it into something tainted by his own arrogance and recklessness? By the time dawn broke, Alexander knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let Sarah go. Not like this. Not without fighting for her. For them. But the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. He had to confront not only his own mistakes, but also the people who had enabled him. And at the center of it all was Melissa Davenport, the architect of the evening's disaster. His jaw tightened as he thought of her smug smile, the glee in her voice as she exposed the truth. She had used his past mistake to destroy the one thing that mattered most to him, and she'd done it without remorse. Melissa wouldn't get the last word. The days following Melissa's public revelation were some of the darkest Alexander had known. Sarah didn't return his calls or answer his messages. Every attempt to reach her was met with silence, leaving him to stew in his guilt and regret. The penthouse, once bustling with their shared moments, now felt cavernous and cold. The city, however, was anything but silent. Melissa's calculated blow had set the rumor mill spinning at full speed. Whispers of Alexander's bets spread like wildfire, infiltrating not just the elite social circles, but the press as well. Articles speculating on the details of his relationship with Sarah began appearing online, many of them cruel and sensationalized. "She must have known," one column opined, its tone dripping with condescension. A woman like Sarah Roberts couldn't possibly believe she was Alexander Carter's first choice. Alexander's fists clenched as he read the words, anger bubbling under his skin. It wasn't just his reputation on the line anymore. It was Sarah's dignity, her very sense of self-worth. He could handle being vilified by the press, but watching Sarah's name dragged through the mud was unbearable. Melissa, predictably, basked in the chaos. She made herself available for every social engagement, dropping cryptic remarks and half-smiles that only fueled speculation. She was careful not to say too much, positioning herself as a mere observer rather than the orchestrator of the scandal. But Alexander knew better. Alexander stood outside the Davenport estate, his jaw tight as he rang the doorbell. The grandeur of Melissa's home, with its towering columns and meticulously manicured lawns, felt like a mockery of her poisonous nature. When Melissa opened the door, her face lit up in mock surprise. "Alexander," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What an unexpected visit." "I'm not here for pleasantries, Melissa," Alexander said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, shutting the door behind him. "Well, do come in," she said dryly, gesturing toward the sitting room. Alexander didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding as he fixed her with a cold glare. "You've done enough damage," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "It ends now." Melissa arched an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Damage? I merely told the truth, Alexander. Isn't that what everyone wants these days? Honesty? Don't insult my intelligence," he snapped. "You didn't do this for honesty. You did it to humiliate Sarah and ruin our relationship. Well, congratulations, you succeeded. But it's over. You're not going to use her as a pawn in whatever twisted game you're playing." Melissa's smile sharpened. "You're giving me far too much credit. Sarah's humiliation was your doing, not mine. If you hadn't made that little bet, there'd be nothing to expose." His jaw tightened. "You don't get to absolve yourself of this. You weaponized my mistake and turned it into a public spectacle. And now, you're going to fix it." Her laughter was light, but cold. "And how exactly do you propose I do that?" "You're going to tell the truth," he said firmly. "You're going to admit that you used private information to humiliate Sarah out of spite. And you're going to retract every word you said about her." Melissa tilted her head, her smile fading slightly as she realized he wasn't bluffing. "And if I don't?" Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. The lies you've told, the people you've hurt, the lengths you'll go to for attention. I've kept quiet about your indiscretions for years, Melissa. But believe me, that silence ends today if you push me." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she seemed to consider her options. "You wouldn't dare," she said, though there was a flicker of doubt in her voice. "Try me," Alexander said simply. Melissa didn't give in easily, but Alexander left her with no choice. Within days, a carefully crafted statement appeared in the press, framing her previous comments as misunderstandings and absolving Sarah of any knowledge of the bet. While it didn't erase the damage entirely, it shifted the narrative enough to stem the worst of the backlash. Still, Alexander knew it wasn't enough, not for Sarah. Meanwhile, Sarah had retreated to the quiet safety of Margaret's home. The older woman had insisted she stay there, offering her the comfort of a friend and a sanctuary from the chaos outside. "I don't understand how he could do this," Sarah confided one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. Her voice was hoarse from crying, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "How could he look me in the eyes and make me believe he cared when it all started with a lie?" "People make mistakes," Margaret said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Big ones, sometimes. But it's how they try to fix those mistakes that shows who they really are." "I don't even know if I want to give him the chance to fix it," Sarah admitted. "I don't know if I can ever trust him again." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's something only you can decide. But don't let Melissa Davenport or anyone else make that decision for you. Whatever happens, make sure it's your choice." 2 days later, Sarah received a call from the local community center. It was unexpected, but when the director explained that Alexander had arranged for a donation in her mother's name to fund a new literacy program, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "He said it was something your mother would have been proud of," the director said warmly. Sarah hung up the phone, her emotions swirling. She didn't know what Alexander's gesture meant, whether it was an attempt to manipulate her or a genuine act of remorse, but it made her pause nonetheless. Later that evening, she sat alone in Margaret's guest room, staring at the worn journal where she kept her thoughts. Slowly, she began to write, her pen moving almost of its own accord. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about deciding whether the door should stay closed forever, or whether it's worth seeing what's on the other side. She closed the journal, her decision still uncertain, but her heart slightly less heavy. Sarah stood in the quiet community center, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the distant chatter of children in the reading room. The director, a warm woman in her 50s named Paula, was giving Sarah a tour of the newly funded literacy program. "It's been such a blessing," Paula said, her voice brimming with gratitude. "We've already enrolled over 30 kids, and the resources Alexander donated have made all the difference. He told me this was something deeply personal to you, something that would honor your mother's legacy." Sarah's chest tightened, her hand brushing over the nameplate mounted on the wall outside the reading room, the Marion Roberts Literacy Initiative. Her mother's name, etched in elegant script, seemed to glow under the soft light. "Alexander didn't have to do this," Paula added, her tone careful. "But it's clear he wanted to, for you." Sarah's throat tightened as emotion welled up inside her. She managed a faint smile, thanking Paula before stepping outside into the brisk autumn air. The crisp wind carried the faint scent of leaves and distant traffic, grounding her as she stood on the steps of the center. She wasn't ready to call Alexander, not yet, but the gesture, as grand as it was, touched something deep inside her, a small crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Back at Margaret's house, Sarah found herself pacing the living room later that evening. Margaret sat nearby, quietly knitting but stealing occasional glances at her friend's restless movements. "Something on your mind?" Margaret finally asked, setting her needles down. Sarah sighed, sitting heavily on the couch. "He did something for my mother, for her memory. He didn't have to, and yet he did." Margaret tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "And how does that make you feel?" "Confused," Sarah admitted, rubbing her temples. "I'm angry at him, Margaret, furious. But this wasn't about him. It was about her, and about me. He knows how much she meant to me, and he went out of his way to honor that." Margaret nodded slowly. "Sometimes actions speak louder than words. But that doesn't mean you have to forgive him if you're not ready." "I don't even know if I can," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret reached out, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's knee. "Then take your time. You'll know what's right when you're ready." The next day, Sarah found herself walking through Central Park. It had always been her favorite place to think, a small oasis of calm amidst the chaos of the city. As she rounded a corner near the lake, she stopped abruptly. Alexander was there. He stood by the water, his coat flapping lightly in the breeze, his hands buried in his pockets. His gaze was distant, his expression uncharacteristically somber. He didn't see her at first, and for a moment, Sarah debated turning around and walking away. But something held her in place, summoning her courage. She stepped forward. Alexander. He turned quickly, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to speak or move, as though afraid she might vanish. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice tentative. "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't plan on it," she replied, folding her arms against the chill. "But maybe it's time we talked." Alexander nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'd like that, more than anything." They found a bench near the water, the gentle lapping of the lake providing a soothing backdrop. For a while, neither of them spoke, the weight of their unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" "The literacy program." Alexander sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Because I wanted to show you that I see you, Sarah. I see what matters to you, what shaped you. Your mother was such a huge part of who you are, and I wanted to honor that. Not to fix what I did, not to manipulate you, but because it felt right." She studied him carefully, searching his face for signs of insincerity. But all she saw was raw honesty, his usual polished confidence stripped away. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hurt and curiosity. "From the beginning." He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Because I was a coward. At first, I didn't think it mattered. It was just a stupid bet, something I never thought would mean anything. But then I got to know you, and I realized how wrong I was. And by then, I was too afraid to lose you by admitting the truth. You hurt me, Alexander," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "You made me believe in something that wasn't real." And then Melissa. She broke off, the memory of that humiliating night still fresh in her mind. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I know I hurt you in ways I can never take back. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that what I feel for you now, it's real. It's always been real. You changed me, Sarah. You made me see how empty my life was before you." She looked down at her hands, her thoughts swirling. "I don't know if I can trust you again. Trust is fragile. Once it's broken, it's hard to rebuild. I'll spend the rest of my life proving myself to you, if that's what it takes," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his words. "I don't want to live a life without you, Sarah, but I'll respect whatever choice you make." Her chest ached at his words, the sincerity in his tone breaking through her defenses. She wanted to believe him, to let herself hope again, but the wounds were still raw. "I need time," she said softly, her voice firm but not unkind. Alexander nodded, his expression one of quiet resignation. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." As she stood and walked away, Sarah felt the weight of his gaze on her back. She didn't look back, but a part of her couldn't help wondering if there was still a path forward for them. A path built not on lies, but on something genuine. Melissa Davenport's mornings always began with the same routine: freshly brewed coffee from her state-of-the-art kitchen, a leisurely scan of the latest society news on her tablet, and the satisfaction of seeing her name, or at least her picture, featured prominently among the city's elite. But this morning was different. As she sipped her coffee, her tablet lit up with an alert. The headline was bold, the kind that demanded attention. "Manhattan's Queen of Scandal Exposed. Melissa Davenport's Web of Lies." Melissa nearly choked on her coffee. Her fingers trembled as she opened the article, her eyes scanning the text with increasing panic. The piece was a thorough expose, detailing her years of manipulation, from sabotaging rivals at charity galas to leaking false stories to the press. It even hinted at her involvement in fabricating financial documents to maintain her extravagant lifestyle after her husband, Victor, had quietly begun divorce proceedings months ago. The worst part, the article credited multiple anonymous sources, their quotes damning. "She thrives on chaos," one source had said. "Melissa doesn't just step over people to climb higher. She crushes them." Melissa's blood ran cold as she read the final paragraph. While Melissa Davenport has long been known for her sharp wit and ambition, recent revelations paint a darker picture of a woman willing to destroy lives to maintain her position in Manhattan's social hierarchy. The question remains, how much longer can she hold onto her crown? Her phone buzzed incessantly with incoming texts and calls, but she ignored them. She knew what they would say. The whispers of the social elite were already louder than ever, and Melissa Davenport was no longer the queen. They'd crowned her the villain. Across town, Alexander Carter sat in his office, his phone ringing with congratulations from those who had always despised Melissa's reign of terror. But Alexander didn't feel triumphant. His goal hadn't been to gloat or destroy her outright, but to ensure that her influence was neutralized once and for all. He'd spent weeks collecting evidence, carefully piecing together her lies, gathering testimonies from those she'd wronged, and ensuring the press had all the ammunition they needed to dismantle her empire. But one loose end remained. Melissa's estate was eerily quiet when Alexander arrived that evening. The usual hum of staff and visitors was absent, the sprawling home feeling more like an empty shell. Melissa answered the door herself, her flawless makeup failing to hide the strain on her face. She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe as she fixed him with a glare. "Well, if it isn't Alexander Carter," she said, her tone biting. "Come to gloat." "No," Alexander said evenly. "I came to make something clear." Melissa stepped aside, allowing him in with a sarcastic wave of her hand. "By all means, enlighten me. I could use the entertainment." Alexander stepped into the opulent sitting room, his expression calm but firm. "You've spent years tearing people down, Melissa. People who trusted you, who let you into their lives. Sarah was the last straw for me. You didn't just hurt her. You humiliated her publicly, for no reason other than your own bitterness." Melissa scoffed, sinking into a velvet armchair. "Spare me the lecture, Alexander. Sarah was an easy target, and you know it. She doesn't belong in our world, and deep down, even you must see that." "You're wrong," Alexander said sharply. "Sarah belongs wherever she chooses to be. She's worth 100 of you, Melissa, because she doesn't need to tear people down to feel important." Her mask of confidence cracked for a split second, but she quickly replaced it with a sneer. "And what now? You've ruined me. Are you satisfied?" Alexander shook his head. "This isn't about me being satisfied. It's about making sure you can't hurt anyone else. Consider this the end of your games, Melissa. Whatever power you thought you had, it's gone. You've burned too many bridges, and there's no one left to save you." Melissa stared at him, her composure finally slipping as the weight of his words sank in. "You think you're better than me," she said bitterly, "but you're not. You're just a man trying to play hero for a woman who's too broken to save herself." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he turned toward the door, his voice calm but resolute. "Goodbye, Melissa." As he left, Melissa sank deeper into her chair, the realization dawning that she was well and truly alone. In the days that followed, Melissa's fall from grace was swift and brutal. Invitations to events dried up, her former friends distancing themselves as the full extent of her actions came to light. Victor finalized their divorce, reclaiming much of the fortune she had used to fund her lavish lifestyle. And for the first time in years, Melissa Davenport found herself without the power or influence she had so carefully cultivated. Meanwhile, Sarah began to hear whispers of Melissa's downfall, though she didn't know the full story. Margaret had brought it up casually one evening, her tone careful. "Did you hear about Melissa Davenport?" Margaret asked as they prepared dinner. Sarah's hands stilled over the cutting board. "What about her?" "She's fallen out of favor," Margaret said delicately. "It seems people are finally seeing her for who she really is." Sarah said nothing, her mind racing. She couldn't deny the flicker of satisfaction at the news, but it was tempered by the complexity of her own emotions. She wasn't a vengeful person by nature, and she wondered what role, if any, Alexander had played in Melissa's undoing. Later that evening, as she sat by the window with her journal, Sarah found herself writing again. It's strange to see justice served, even when it's deserved. But the question remains, what does it change for me? As she closed the journal, she realized she still didn't have an answer. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Sarah had last seen Alexander. Though her days were quieter, her mind was anything but. The echoes of his words, his sincerity, and his regret played over and over in her head. She couldn't deny that he was trying, his gestures, his patience, and even the fall of Melissa Davenport, which she suspected wasn't a coincidence, all pointed to a man who was determined to make things right. And yet, trust was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as she was helping Margaret organize the cafe stock, the bell above the door jingled softly. Sarah glanced up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Alexander standing just inside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He looked almost unsure of himself, a rare vulnerability in a man who usually exuded confidence. Margaret glanced between them, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I'll just step out for a bit," she said, disappearing into the back before Sarah could protest. Alexander took a hesitant step forward. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and careful. "I wasn't sure if I should come, but I needed to see you." Sarah set down the stack of books in her hands, folding her arms as she regarded him. "What do you want, Alexander?" "To apologize," he said immediately. Properly this time. She raised an eyebrow, skepticism flickering across her face. "You've apologized already." "Not the way I should have," he admitted, taking another step closer. "And not for everything." The sincerity in his tone gave her pause, but she remained guarded. "I'm listening." Alexander exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't even know where to start. What I did to you, what I let happen, it was unforgivable. I took something beautiful and real and tarnished it with my own selfishness and stupidity." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration with himself evident. "When I first met you, I thought it was just a game. I was arrogant, blind to what really mattered. But the more time I spent with you, the more I realized how wrong I was. You're not just extraordinary, you're everything I never knew I needed. And by the time I figured that out, I was too much of a coward to come clean." Sarah's arms loosened slightly, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "I didn't just hurt you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I betrayed your trust, your dignity, your heart, and I can never undo that. But I want you to know that I see you, Sarah. I see your strength, your brilliance, your kindness. And I love you, not because of some stupid bet, but because of the person you are." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but if there's even a part of you that can forgive me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you. Not with words, but with actions. Whatever it takes, for however long it takes." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah felt as though the world had gone still. I don't know if I can trust you again," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight." "I know," Alexander said quietly, "and I'm not asking for it right away. I'm asking for the chance to earn it back." One step at a time, Sarah studied him, her heart warring with her mind. She wanted to believe him, to let herself hope, but the scars of his betrayal still lingered. "Why now?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why not just let me go?" "Because I can't," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine a life without you, Sarah. You've changed me in ways I didn't think were possible. And I'm not the man I was when this started. I'm better because of you." Her eyes welled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "This isn't something I can just decide, Alexander. It's going to take time." He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting." For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. Over the following days, Alexander's actions spoke louder than his words. He didn't overwhelm her with grand gestures or push for her forgiveness. Instead, he supported her quietly, showing up when she needed him most. He volunteered at the community center, helping with the literacy program in her mother's name. He arranged for her favorite local poets to speak at the bookstore, subtly encouraging her to reconnect with her love of literature. And most importantly, he gave her space, letting her decide when she was ready to let him back into her life. Margaret noticed the change in Sarah, the way her guard began to drop, piece by piece. "He's trying," Margaret said one evening as they closed up the cafe. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "And that's what scares me." Margaret gave her a gentle smile. "Sometimes love is scary, Sarah, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it." A month after their conversation in the cafe, Sarah found herself standing outside the community center. She watched as Alexander knelt beside a group of children, helping them sound out words from a colorful storybook. His expression was gentle, his patience endless as he guided them. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something shift in her heart, a quiet warmth, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it was worth taking the risk. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Sarah found herself standing in her small apartment, staring at a box of items she hadn't touched in years. Inside were photographs, letters, and mementos of a life she had long since left behind. Among them was a framed picture of her mother, Marion, smiling warmly, her eyes full of pride. Sarah ran her fingers over the edge of the frame, her emotions swirling. Her mother had been her anchor, her guide through life's chaos. She often wondered what Marion would say now, about her choices, her heartbreaks, and the man who was so desperately trying to prove his worth to her. "You'd probably tell me to follow my heart," Sarah murmured aloud, her voice thick with emotion. She sat down, the rain pattering against the windows, and allowed herself to reflect. Alexander had hurt her deeply, but in the weeks since the truth had come out, he had shown her something she hadn't expected: growth. His actions had been deliberate and consistent, each one reinforcing his sincerity. But trust, as Sarah knew, was fragile. Could she trust him again? That afternoon, Sarah found herself walking toward the community center, umbrella in hand. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say to Alexander, but she knew it was time to confront her feelings. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, and volunteers bustled about with books and supplies. In the reading room, Sarah spotted Alexander sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a group of children. He was animated, holding up a book and gesturing wildly as he read aloud. The children giggled, leaning in closer with every word. Sarah stood in the doorway, her chest tightening as she watched him. He seemed so natural, so unguarded in this moment. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before. Gentle, patient, and entirely focused on others. When the story ended and the children dispersed to find new books, Alexander looked up and spotted her. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, but it quickly softened into a tentative smile. "Sarah," he said, rising to his feet. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wasn't sure I'd come," she admitted, stepping inside. He studied her carefully, his usual confidence tempered by caution. "I'm glad you did." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the center filling the gaps between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I've been watching you," she said, her voice steady. "The way you've handled yourself these past few weeks. You've kept your word, Alexander. And I see that. I see the effort you've made, not just for me, but for this community." His expression softened further, but he remained quiet, letting her continue. "You hurt me in ways I didn't think I could recover from," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you've also shown me a side of yourself that I didn't think existed, a side that's kind, thoughtful, and willing to change." She paused, her fingers tightening around the handle of her umbrella. "I'm not saying it's easy to forget what happened. I don't know if I ever truly will, but I'm willing to try, if you are." Alexander's breath caught, his eyes glinting with emotion. He stepped closer, his voice low and earnest. "I'll try every day, Sarah. For as long as it takes, I'll prove to you that this is real, that I'm real." She nodded, her chest tightening as tears welled in her eyes. "I don't want grand gestures or promises you can't keep. I just want honesty. If we're going to do this, it has to be built on something real." "It will be," he said firmly. "I swear to you, Sarah, no more lies, no more games, just us." For the first time, in what felt like forever, Sarah let herself believe him. Slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. He took it gently, his touch warm and reassuring. "Okay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's try." In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Alexander began rebuilding their relationship from the ground up. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of hurt and hesitation, but there were also moments of connection and joy. Alexander proved himself in ways both small and significant. He didn't try to overwhelm her with his wealth or charm. Instead, he showed up when it mattered. Whether it was helping at the community center, listening to her talk about her favorite books, or simply sitting with her in comfortable silence, he was present. For Sarah, the process of healing was gradual but profound. She began to let go of the pain and anger, replacing it with cautious hope. And as the weeks turned into months, the foundation of their relationship grew stronger, built not on lies, but on trust and mutual respect. One crisp evening, as they strolled through Central Park hand in hand, Alexander stopped suddenly, pulling Sarah gently toward him. "There's something I need to say," he said, his tone serious. Sarah tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't deserve you. I never did. But I want you to know that loving you has made me a better man. And I will never stop trying to be the man you deserve." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, reaching up to cup his face. "You already are, Alexander." For the first time, the weight of the past felt truly lifted. And as they stood there, surrounded by the soft glow of the city lights, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the future they were building, one step at a time, together. The small bookstore on Fifth Avenue buzzed with quiet activity as customers browsed the aisles, their murmured conversations blending with the soft hum of a nearby coffee machine. Sarah stood near the register, her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan as she watched a young boy excitedly clutch a copy of Charlotte's Web. "You're going to love that one," she said with a warm smile. The boy's mother nodded appreciatively as they headed toward the checkout. Sarah turned her attention back to the shelves, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had been missing for so long. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home, not just in the bookstore, but in her life. The literacy program in her mother's name had flourished over the past few months, with dozens of children and adults alike benefiting from its resources. Sarah had begun teaching again, hosting weekly workshops at the community center. It was a small step, but one that reminded her of the passion she'd once felt in the classroom. And then there was Alexander. He entered the store a few moments later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. His coat was slightly damp from the drizzle outside, and his hair was tousled in a way that made him look more approachable than ever. "Peace offering," he said, handing her one of the cups. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What did you do?" "Nothing yet," he replied with a grin, "but I'm covering my bases." She laughed softly, taking the cup from him. "Smart man." Alexander's expression softened as he looked at her, the love and admiration in his eyes unmistakable. "How's it going today?" "Good," she said, glancing around the store. "Busy, but that's a good thing." He leaned against the counter, watching her with quiet affection. "You seem happy." "I am," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "It feels good to be back here, to be doing something that matters." "You always mattered," Alexander said firmly. "You just needed the world to catch up." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. Their relationship had grown in ways she never thought possible, and though there were still challenges, they faced them together with honesty and mutual respect. Later that evening, Sarah and Alexander hosted a small gathering at the community center. It was a celebration of the literacy program's success, and the room was filled with families, volunteers, and supporters. As Sarah stood near the podium, watching the children read their favorite books aloud, she felt a deep sense of pride. This wasn't just her mother's legacy, it was her own. Alexander joined her, sliding his arm around her waist. "You did this," he said softly. "We did this," she corrected, leaning into him. When the speeches ended, Alexander took the microphone, clearing his throat. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Sarah looked at him, startled. "Alexander, who are you?" "Trust me," he whispered with a smile. Turning back to the crowd, he continued, "This program is more than just a tribute to a remarkable woman. It's a testament to resilience, hope, and the power of love. And none of it would exist without Sarah Roberts." The room erupted into applause, but Alexander wasn't finished. He turned to Sarah, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You've shown me what it means to love selflessly, to forgive, and to grow. And I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me." Before Sarah could fully process his words, Alexander dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Gasps and cheers rippled through the crowd as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "will you marry me again? For real this time, with no lies, no games, just us, building a future together." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked down at him. The room seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in that moment. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, Alexander, I will." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time in years, Sarah felt whole, her heart open, her future bright. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the garden of the community center. Surrounded by friends, family, and the children who had benefited from the program, Sarah and Alexander exchanged vows that were heartfelt and deeply personal. "I promise to love you," Alexander said, his voice steady, "not for who I thought you were, but for who you truly are. And I promise to spend every day proving that you can trust me with your heart." "I promise to love you," Sarah replied, her voice strong, "not for the man you were, but for the man you've become. And I promise to walk beside you, no matter where life takes us." As they kissed, the crowd erupted into cheers, and for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the past truly lift. In the months that followed, Sarah and Alexander embraced their new life together. Sarah expanded her teaching workshops, mentoring others who had faced emotional and personal challenges. Alexander shifted his focus toward philanthropy, using his resources to support causes that mattered to them both. Their love wasn't perfect, it was real, built on trust, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. And as they faced the future hand in hand, they knew they'd found something far greater than a fairy tale. They'd found each other.